Okay folks, in this lesson we learn about Arnold's hair shader. This is the scene we are going to be working with. You can find this model in your Conan browser. Now, to see different aspect of the hair a bit better, I am going to hide the head and deal with just the hair. To hide the hair, instead of using Cinema 4D's traffic lights, because you're dealing with hair and it might get finicky, I'm just going to use Arnold Parameters tag to hide it. So let's right click on this main mesh object and add an Arnold Parameters tag, and let's hide all of its visibility and cast shadows option. Also, let's add another Arnold Parameter tag to hair geometries that we have here. First of all, add an Arnold Parameters tag to the hair geometry that is a child of the main mesh geometry, and make sure all the visibility options are checked, because this hair geometry is a child of the main mesh geometry. If we don't add this new Arnold Parameter tag, the hair geometry would be hidden like its parent. And also, to keep the consistency, let's add an Arnold Parameters tag to the other two hair geometries that we have in the scene. Also, there are a few times in this lesson we're going to use this Arnold Parameters tag for different options, as you see. Now, in Cinema 4D, when you add hair to an object, automatically a hair material will be applied to that geometry, or you can add a Cinema 4D hair material to the hair geometry. As you can see in the scene, we have three hair objects that combined together produce this beautiful hair, and each one has one Cinema 4D hair material applied to. This Cinema 4D hair material, in case you don't know, controls so many things. For example, the color of the hair, how thin or thick it is, whether the hair has kink, freeze or clamp into it, and stuff like that. Now, when you work with Arnold and add an Arnold hair shader to the hair object, you only control the color of the hair, the specular attributes of the hair, its opacity and transmission properties also, and the other properties of the hair, like how thin or thick the hair strands are, or whether it has kink to it or not, comes from the Cinema 4D's hair material. So you don't need to delete the Cinema 4D's hair material, and you really shouldn't. You just add an Arnold hair shader beside an existing Cinema 4D's hair material. Now let's create a new Arnold hair shader. So go to Create menu, Arnold, Surface, and Hair. And let me apply it to our three hair objects and run the IPR. Great. Let me also use my render region tool and render only the hair portion of the image, so it would be a bit quicker. Now we are dealing with Arnold's hair shader. Let me double click on the hair shader and open it up. As you can see, we have diffuse, specular, secondary specular, transmission, opacity, and UV sections, and we're going to go through all of them in this lesson. Starting with the diffuse, we have root color, which controls the color at the root of the hair. And we can go ahead and play around and use different color, and you can see the changes in the IPR. Let me change it to maybe this crazy blue color, and you can immediately see the changes in the IPR. Even though it is, it's not quite obvious, because down here we have a very strong specular weight, and if I zero out my specular weight, you start to see that blue color at the root of our hair strands. Also, we have tip color, which controls the color at the tip of the hair. Let me select this red color here, so you can see the change here quite apparently. Let me reset the root and the tip color to the default. Well, you can go ahead and experiment with different colors, or take sample from hair color charts and use different combination to achieve different types of hair. Now, then we have Ambient Diffuse, which blends between two different diffuse shading models. When set to 0, the diffuse part of the shader will be fully isotropic and the hair strands will reflect the same amount of light towards the camera no matter which direction the light is coming from. And when set to 1, the light shining down on the tip of a hair will not brighten the strand as much as light shining in from the sides. Now let me open up my picture viewer and show you two different renders with Ambient Diffuse set to 0 and 1. Now if you compare these two renders, the difference is really not that huge and you can barely see it, but in different situations the difference might be huge. Now let me close the picture viewer, reset the Ambient Diffuse to default, so now it is 0.6 and we are having a combination of that two different shading model that we discussed. Also let me set the specular weight back to 1. Next we have Indirect Diffuse. By default it is set to 0. That means global illumination or indirect lighting won't affect the hair shader, and this way we are gonna get faster renders. If I set it to 1, now indirect lighting will affect the hair. Now you can increase this value to be more than 1, but that wouldn't be physically accurate and you would have noise and flickering issues. So stay between 0 and 1. Now I personally tend to change this value to 1 all the time. This way the render is looking better and the root and the tip color you define are gonna show off in the render more accurately. But at the same time, remember, it's gonna increase your render time a lot. Let me show you a few renders with different indirect diffuse values. At the first one we have no indirect diffuse at all, and at the second one it is set to 1. And when you compare it to the previous one, the difference is quite obvious. The overall shader is brighter, and the very dark part inside the hair where no direct light can reach also isn't that dark and receives some indirect lighting. And for the last render I changed the indirect diffuse to 5, and as you can see now GI is affecting the hair shader 5 times as the previous render, and we get this kinda unrealistic result. But the shader is much brighter compared to the previous render. Great. Now let me close this window and make sure the IPR is running and you have a tight render region here. We have our IPR running. Let me close my picture viewer and set my indirect diffuse to 1. Also, just for fun, let me change my root color to the 5th color from the right and my tip color to the 6th color from the right here. And now we have a different color. Then we have specular section. The first parameter is glossiness, how much specular highlights should be diffused or sharp. As you increase this value, you are going to get sharper specular highlights on the hair, and when you decrease it you are making the specular highlights very diffused or rough, you might say. Now the reasonable number here can be between 10 and 500. Let me show you two renders with glossiness set to 10 and 500. In the first render glossiness is set to 10 and we have very diffused specular highlights, and in the second render, as you can see, glossiness is set to 500 and we get much sharper specular highlights compared to the previous render. Let me set my glossiness to something like 150 and make sure the IPR is running. Now we have specular weight. Basically how much specular you want on your hair. As you decrease this value, you are reducing the overall amount of specular highlights on the hair. Now you should stay between 0 and 1 here also. Then you can control the color of the specular highlights. I can change it to a crazy color like maybe this purple, and you can immediately see the change. Now depending on the hair color you are trying to achieve, the specular color might vary, but normally this color is white in most cases. Let me set it back to white here so I can explain angular shift value a bit easier. We have angular shift, which can be used to offset the specular highlights along the hair strands, and for human hair this value is kind of about -5, something like that. Now take a look at the IPR. As I decrease my angular shift to negative values, specular highlights tend to offset to the root of the hair strand. So let me reduce this value to -50. Set it back to 0. Back to -50. Maybe -20. So as you can see, we are moving specular highlights along the hair strands. Now let me set this value back to -5. We also have secondary specular highlights with the same control we had in the specular section. Generally speaking, secondary speculars tend to be diffuser, so the glassiness value should be smaller compared to specular section, and also they tend to shift more towards the root of the hair, so you probably need to use a higher negative value in the angular shift for your secondary specular highlights. Let me set my secondary specular glassiness to 50, so it is diffuser compared to the primary specular highlights, which is set to 150 right now, and sets my angular shift to -15, so it shifts more towards the root of the hair. You can see the result in the IPR. Now let me show you the render in the picture viewer with the settings that we have currently. As you can see, we have a very beautiful and realistic hair render. I mean, very exciting. I believe hair shader in Arnold is one of the best I have ever seen in any render engine. I mean, look at this render, for God's sake. It's simply amazing, and we can even make it look much better by decreasing the opacity. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. Now let me close the picture viewer. Then we have transmission section. To see the effect of the transmission section a bit better, let me close my hair shader and go to my second camera. Let's open up the hair shader again and make sure IPR is running. Now, transmission effects basically allows the light rays to shine through the hair strands, and to see this effect, the hair object must be between the light source and the camera. That is why I am using my second camera, and we have this huge area light source behind the hair object right now. First we have this transmission value, how much the light rays should shine through, and as I increase this value you start to see the light source is shining through the hair. Now let's show you a few render with different transmission amounts so we don't have to wait for the IPR to clean up. We have 3 renders with transmission value set to 0, 1, and 5. So at 0 we have absolutely no transmission of light happening. At 1 you can see the effect clearly and the light rays shining through, and at 5 we have quite an exaggerated effect, and you can compare these renders together. Let me close my picture viewer and run the IPR again. You can change the color of the transmission effect using the color value. Let me use this crazy cyan color here, and you can see the change in the IPR immediately. Let's set the color back to its default value. Finally, we have spread. Smaller values will result in more focused transmission effect, and higher values will give broader effect. So when set to 1 we get this focused over the edge effect, but when I increase this value to something like 10 maybe, you can see the effect is much broader and we don't see those bright edges anymore, and the effect is basically distributed more equally throughout the hair. Let me reset all my transmission values back to default and get back to my main camera. The next section is opacity, which lets you control whether a hair is fully opaque or transparent. By default, it is set to white. That means fully opaque hair. And as you use darker colors here, you're going to have more transparent hair. As I darken the opacity color, I am not seeing any changes in the IPR. And that is because every time we are trying to achieve some sort of transparency in Arnold for Cinema 4D, or in Arnold generally, we should tell Arnold that this object has some transparency quality. And as you remember from previous lessons, you need to go to your Arnold Parameters tag and uncheck the opaque option. So let's select the Arnold Parameters tag for our 3 hair objects and uncheck the opaque option. Now, as I darken the opacity color, we start to see more transparent hair object. Let me show you 2 renders with different opacity colors. At the first render, opacity is set to 1 and we get this very opaque hair. And in the second render, I am using a light gray color with 80% value, so a bit off-white. I can show you the exact color that I'm using actually if I open up the opacity color for this hair shader. This is the color that I actually used. Now let's get back to the picture viewer, and as you can see, the second render with darker opacity color makes the hair to appear softer and more realistic. And they might have used some sort of conditioner here, I don't know. But bear in mind, using darker colors for opacity is gonna increase your render time. In this case, it took almost twice compared to when we had fully opaque hair, but definitely I think it's worth it. I mean, the render is it looks much better. The hair is softer and more realistic. So I suggest that you actually try to use a slightly darker color, maybe 80-85% gray color instead of fully white color if you have the time, because it's really gonna be much better. Let me close my picture viewer again, and if you use darker opacity color, I mean very dark, it would make the hair object to be more transparent, and I mean something like 0.3, 0.2, it would make the hair to be barely visible. Let me reset the opacity color to its default white color. Also, let me select the Arnold Parameters tags, apply to my hair object, and enable the opaque option again. Finally, we have this UV section in case you wanted to map a texture to your hair, for example, root and tip color, like when trying to simulate tiger for, So in this case, you need to do the following. In the UV section, type uparam chord in the uparam field and type vparam chord in the vparam field. Okay, now select the Arnold Parameters tag, apply to the hair objects, and make sure to check export UVs. Okay, now open up the network editor and load an image node. Let's use this grad 3 texture and connect it to the root color and the tip color of the hair shader. Great. Also, let me decrease the specular weight for the primary and secondary specular highlights to something like 0.2 so we can see the texture a bit better. And let's make sure the IPR is running. Now, as you can see, the texture has been applied properly. So you can use another texture, but generally speaking, that's how you apply a texture to your hair shader attributes, and it can be other attributes like, for example, specular weight or something like that. Now, finally, remember, you can still change the Cinema 4D's hair material and change the different aspect of the hair strands, like their thickness, for example. You just need to open the Cinema 4D's hair material and start tweaking stuff, and they will be applied, and you can see the result even in your IPR. So that's one of the great features of Arnold for Cinema 4D, that it actually supports the Cinema 4D's hair material. Also, if you select one of the Arnold Parameters tag applied to the hair objects, you see we have this minimum pixel width option. So if you don't want to deal with the anti-aliasing issues caused by very thin hair strands, in this case you can actually increase your anti-aliasing sample to get rid of those, but that would make the render time to increase. You can simply define a minimum pixel width like 1, so the strands can't be thinner than 1 pixel, but it would cause some clamping in the hair strands, but in some cases it can be very useful and it can decrease your render time and make your render look better. So that is about Arnold hair shader. It was a long lesson, but I think it was really exciting and the result is really amazing. What Arnold hair shader can does is spectacular among other render engines. I hope you are enjoying this course and learning at the same time. Stay tuned with mographplus.com. See you in the next lesson. Thank you for watching this tutorial. It was a free sample from our course Comprehensive Introduction to Arnold for Cinema 4D. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check the entire course out. See you next time.